tell you the big shoulder look is out? You know, I have met some dumb blondes in my life, but you take the taco, pal. Only a Carpathian would come back to life now and choose New York. Tasty pick, bonehead. If you had brain one in that huge melon on top of your neck, you would be living the sweet life out in Southern California's beautiful San Fernando Valley.
As you might have noticed from the previous clip from Ghostbusters 2, Dr. Venkman references that Vigo, the villain of the film, is a Carpathian, and uses this knowledge to insult the intelligence of the spirit in order to buy more time for the group to save the child. This example encompasses a rationale that most Westerners have when looking towards Eastern Europe, especially in the horror genre of today's film and works of fiction. The question is why? Why so often are the villains, or the monsters, or the spirits portrayed in these works Eastern in their origin? The following presentation will explore this idea looking at popularized fiction. When viewing history from a modern perspective, it's easy to see it as a stationary fixture of times and events that culminate into the aggregate data of cause and effect. For instance, the bombing of Pearl Harbor can be viewed as the impetus for the United States' entry into World War II. But perhaps just as important are the social movements, the grassroots beliefs of the common person, which inherently shapes the world as we see it, a history that is overlooked extensively and often. When studying ancient Greece, an archaeologist might look to the written history, the extensive ruins, or the remnants of tools or other living implements that have been left behind for centuries in order to solve the mysteries about how a person might have lived in this particular time and place. But equally important to these items, the literature of Homer might be analyzed to shed light on the missing element, the human element. This type of information can be used to fill in gaps absent in our knowledge. Equally important to all of this is the myths of the people, the stories that people create in order to explain or even add mystery or excitement to the mundane. In our own culture, we have added myths to our own history to elevate particular people, adding an element of the fantastic to our own history. But what is the rationale? Why is it necessary for George Washington to have chopped down the cherry tree and never told a lie? What does this commentary tell us about the people that created the story? The fact is that we can use this legend as an allegory to explain what is important in American life. The answer: honesty. This kind of storytelling has been used for centuries, and its origins do not begin with the United States. Of the multitudes of examples that exist, one of the most underexplored is that of Western Europe's view on Eastern Europe, and how it was used as a tool in the belt of an author to bring fear into the hearts of both men and women reading fictional stories in the 19th century, and into the modern horror genre we are so familiar with. There are many varying reasons why literature of Western Europe focused so heavily on the East in this genre, the first being technology. The Industrial Revolution of Western Europe created the right atmosphere for new types of authorship. Between 1500 and 1800, the amount of published books in Europe rose from a modest few copies to approximately 1 billion printed copies. This is the result of the modern printing press and mechanical movable type, as well as cheap rolled paper. These advances not only made books less expensive, but also allowed individuals to have their novels published. This, along with mandated education, resulted in a far more literate populace that was hungry for literature that captured their imaginations, allowing them to have a source of entertainment in order to escape their ordinary lives, permitting brief periods of excitement and wonder. All of this industry had another consequence. Just as in today's society, people look to the past for simplicity, people of the Industrial Revolution did as well. There was a push to reconnect with the past, the ancient past. In the 1700s, nationalism played a huge role in a nation's cultural identity. The further to the past a nation could look for their origins, the more legitimate that nation was. Linguistic experts attempted to find the root of every European language. As expected, many of the nations that were considered inferior found their origins in the East. In Ireland, Charles Vallancey found that the Irish language and postulated that early Phoenician explorers founded Ireland. Culturally, this made sense to the Western Europeans. They saw Ireland as once having great glory, but eventually became corrupted through greed and were reduced to a race of savages. They juxtaposed this with their knowledge of Eastern and Middle Eastern nations, surmising that Ireland was indeed Semitic in their origin, and therefore inferior. The Irish, on the other hand, also embraced this idea, as it promoted that they were once great and could return to that greatness. This new nationalist sentiment also gave them added ammunition in their quest to separate themselves from the English. Vallancey's hypothesis was wrong, and would eventually be proven wrong in the following century. But this did not stop the myth from continuing to be prevalent and pervasive in the minds of the people. The people wanted this connection, so it existed. They wanted a sense of identity to make moves to capture their essence. They did this through a variety of means, but one of the foremost ways was through occultism and secret societies. Once again, they looked east. Having lost much of their knowledge of their ancient Druid past, the people combined what they knew of the Druid religion and filled in the gaps with stories and practices of Eastern Europe and Middle Eastern religions, which had not disappeared as thoroughly as it had in the West. Even more specifically, they looked to Kabbalistic Jewish practices. Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism, and in some instances magic, was practiced for centuries, mostly through Ashkenazic Jews living in Eastern Europe. But because of the increasing violence and the pogroms of the East, many Jewish people began emigrating from the East to the West, bringing their stories with them. So while technology and liberal ideas moved to the East, Eastern European culture and myth moved west in an exchange of ideas. The people of the British Isles found much of their lives mundane. They had lost their mysterious places, dismissed by science, lost by conquest, subdued by religion. The ancient tales were, for all intents and purposes, lost to history, but these new people showing up, they had the key. They were from the outskirts of the empire. They were from a place where the Middle East and Europe coalesced. Their stories were significant and full of wonder that all but escaped reason and science. Their stories were too far away and too long ago to be proven wrong, and they could be adapted into the modern landscape. This mixing of Western and Eastern belief became the cornerstone for almost every new secret society of the day. With the dawn of new printing capabilities, ancient Eastern magical texts began to be published in the West at varying degrees of popularity, but many became the required readings for members of these new groups. While some of the secret societies, like the Rosicrucians or the Freemasons, utilized some of these Eastern symbolism and methods, new groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn took these ideas to a whole new level, and for the first time accepted female members, making their popularity swell. The discourse of information from these groups spread like wildfire across all socioeconomic barriers. From the extremely rich to the masses of paupers, it seemed that everybody was getting this information. New authors also embraced these ideas with open arms and created an entirely new type of fiction, the horror genre. From Bram Stoker's Dracula to Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla to W.B. Yeats. Seemingly almost every popular author of the time took part in one secret society or another. Even authors that had no known relationship to these groups would mention hidden secrets in their novels. For instance, Mary Shelley references Ingolstadt, Germany in Frankenstein, which is widely regarded as the home to the actual historical Illuminati, not the one that Kanye's from. Western ideas about Eastern occultism played an essential role in forming characters that were meant to thrill audiences. These New Age religions and their belief structures are still found in today's popular culture through things like Ouija boards, crystal prayer, healing rituals, etc. Even the Anglican Church began to look east for models on how to get their dwindling participation back up, as they were having historic lows in their parishioners. A popular movement out of Oxford University called the Oxford Movement believed that by adding ritualism back into the Anglican ceremonies, it would encourage more people, especially the poor, to attend services more regularly. The Oxford Movement believed that the main three branches of Christianity, Anglicanism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, should represent a trinity similarly to how Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit represented the Holy Trinity in church doctrine. Anglican ministers began wearing Eucharist vestments, burning incense, and using altar candles. Some ministers even had Gregorian chants included in their lectures. This connection between old and new, east and west, added power back into the Anglican ritual. These new Anglo-Catholics began to look to the power of the Catholic Church, or in some instances the power of the Eastern Orthodox Church, to build mystery and power in their own churches. Like the earlier example of connecting a nation to an older nation gave legitimacy to a group of people, connecting one's church to an older church gave it power. Consider the example of the classic vampire again. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, it is not a Protestant minister that gets rid of the vampire, but a Catholic priest, even though Bram Stoker himself wasn't Catholic. This shift in religious belief from a more fluid model to that of a more rigid, classic model of ritualism, a bottom-up phenomenon, shows just how willing people are to believe that something of an older origin inherently gives it more legitimacy. But perhaps the most pervasive connection between East and West were the actual monsters themselves in horror fiction. One of the strongest examples of monsters from the East, as mentioned before, is the classic vampire. Vampire legends, as they began to unfold in Western Europe, have their strongest ties to the vampire legends of the East. Believing that consumption or tuberculosis was caused inherently by vampirism led to many interesting burial techniques in the East. Tuberculosis, a disease that leads to the wasting away of a previously healthy individual and comes seemingly from nowhere, affected entire villages of people. Absent knowledge about the decomposition of a corpse can lead to a variety of conditions that look like vampirism. The breakdown of a stomach lining or other such processes can lead to what seems to be a trail of blood coming out of the corner of a corpse's mouth, looking as though it had just consumed a blood meal. The hair and fingernails look like they have grown due to the desiccation or drying out of the body, as well as the movement of the corpse due to gas releases or other bloating factors. As a result, it was common practice in a town that was filled with tuberculosis to cut off the limbs, drive a stake through the heart, or even decapitate a corpse, so that they could not attack the living. The tales of these curses spread to Western Europe and eventually became part of the culture there. In some cases, post-mortem anti-vampiric measures even took place in the early colonies of the United States. Bram Stoker's Dracula was loosely based on Vlad the Impaler, a Romanian prince that had 3 reigns as king during the mid-15th century. During his many battles with the Ottoman Turks, he used a method of torture and execution known as impaling, whereby a wooden stake is put through the body, keeping the victim alive in many cases for hours or days until ultimate death. His reputation and exploits were not seen in Eastern Europe as particularly barbaric or drastic, but that he was using his divine Christendom to keep the Muslims out of Christian Europe. Books about his activities became popularized and embellished in Germany when many of the well-known illustrations of him became popularized. Vlad came from the house of Draculesti, eventually becoming Dracula as we know it today. Stoker, for all intents and purposes, came up with the classic vampire. The vampire is a bloodsucker, he's a male, he's from the East, and he can be put to death or at least hurt by Catholic symbolism. Bram Stoker's Dracula, however, was not even the first mention of vampirism in Western European literature. The story of Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu can give us some glimpses to even earlier traditions. Carmilla, unlike Dracula, was first and foremost female. This may seem like a trivial difference, however, female vampirism dates back even further than male vampirism. One of the oldest vampire stories in the world comes to us via biblical texts, including the Kabbalah, which, as stated before, was a very popular text among the Ashkenazi Jews living in Eastern Europe. Lilith, according to the legend, was the first female even before Eve. Whereas Eve was created from Adam's rib, Lilith was created independently and was intended to be Adam's first wife. However, Lilith had a disagreement with Adam. Both partners insisted that they were to be the dominant partner sexually, and both wanted to be on top during sex. Eventually, this disagreement led to Lilith being cast out of the Garden of Eden. She became a demon that would steal babies and essentially rape men. Sleep paralysis is a condition where a person is essentially half asleep and feels as though they can't move. In this condition, many will see the presence of a demon or an alien or a god or any number of illusions. Some have told stories whereby they have woken up to a woman sitting on their chest or other things. This has, for many centuries, been Lilith. If a woman had a missing infant, they were taken by Lilith, and so on. Lilith is considered the first vampire because she steals life by simply breathing a person in. Today, we would recognize this as an energy or psychological vampire in modern film depictions. In today's culture, Lilith has been adopted as one of the symbols of the feminist movement, and in fact has a feminist musical concert entitled Lilith Fair, named for her. Another interesting connection to Eastern Europe is the setting of the novels. Dracula begins in Dracula Castle in Transylvania. Transylvania exists in the western side of modern-day Romania. Dracula, of course, invades London, which inherently shows the people's fear of the outsiders, particularly those from the East. In order to express this fear, Dracula and other male vampires in film depictions and pictures tend to take on stereotypical Jewish characteristics, similarly to how Judas Iscariot looks in medieval paintings. In fact, one film, Dracula 2000, Dracula is none other than Judas himself. Carmilla also takes place in the East, in a place known as Styria, which is in the modern country of Austria on the border of Slovakia, but she stays where she's at. Whether the East comes to the West or stays in its place, one thing is certain. The East is a place of mystery and danger, adding to the beliefs already held by most Westerners that Eastern Europe was backwards and different. Another Western monster with its roots in the East is Frankenstein. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a monster is created by using electricity and the power of science to reanimate dead human tissue. This, of course, feels very relevant in today's world of genetic alteration and 3D printing, but at the time it was revolutionary. This is one of the first instances of science fiction, but the idea of bringing life from inanimate objects is nothing new, and in fact holds its origins once again in the East. Frankenstein's monster, or the modern Prometheus, was created for the good of humanity. Ultimately, this act of playing God results in the monster turning evil and commits the murder of 4 people, a crime that eventually is destroyed for. Similarly, the golem in the Kabbalah tradition is the creation of a human from an inanimate object. This time it is not science that creates it, but the Word of God. The legend goes as follows. A Kabbalah master who knows the scriptures well enough can create a human form out of mud, and through the recitation of various prayers, the mass is turned into a human being. At the end of these prayers, a slip of paper was put into the golem's mouth, or inscribed on its forehead with one single word, Emet, meaning truth in Hebrew. The creation is then put to rest simply by erasing the first letter, creating the Hebrew word Met, meaning death. There are many medieval legends surrounding the golem, which take place in Poland, but I will focus on the most modern of them. As the modern story goes, during a period of intense pogroms during the 16th century, in the city of Prague, in modern-day Czech Republic, a rabbi by the name of Judah ben Bezalel created a golem to protect the Jews living in the ghetto. In one account of the legend, the golem known as Yosef becomes violent to his creators when he is allowed to remain alive during the Sabbath. The golem was destroyed in front of the Old New Synagogue in Prague by removing the letter on the inscription, and the golem fell down into pieces and was transferred to the attic of the synagogue, where it remains to this day. There have been new adaptations and additions to this story as well. In one account, the Nazis were too afraid to destroy or even step foot in the synagogue for fear of the golem, and in another story, a Nazi agent was sent to the attic to destroy the creature, but died instead of unknown causes. There's even depictions of the golem in modern film. In Kevin Smith's feature Dogma, Jay and Silent Bob are attacked by a golem made from human feces. And in Quentin Tarantino's film Inglourious Basterds, the monster once again is mentioned by none other than Hitler himself, when a rumor is spread that the Bear Jew is a golem. Another mention of the golem was in the television series The X-Files, where a golem is created by a Hasidic family to avenge the murder of one of the family members by an anti-Semitic publisher. Similarly to how this story of Lilith has been adapted by the feminist movement as a symbol for change, it seems that the golem might be turning into a symbol for good, at least in Hollywood. History can be looked at through a variety of lenses, the passing of information from one culture to the next. Similarly to how the West initiated revolutions and liberal ideas in the East due to the Napoleonic Wars to change the face of government, myths, legends, religion, and culture spread from the East to the West, and these stories were added and adapted into Western society. This new globalization of ideas was propagated through inexpensive printing and spread among the people where it thrived. What we know of and what we think of Eastern Europe is a direct result of the convergence of a multitude of factors into the minds of Westerners through popular literature. This practice continues to be impressed in the minds of the populace even today through new films, new books, and video games, which still use these same ideas. Indeed, when someone is in need of an outsider, when someone is in need of a villain, and when someone is in need of a scary place, a good place to look is East.